All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome everyone to the Orange County World Trade Week Forum, navigating the new trade landscape in digital rather than in-person form. My name is Linda DiMario. I'm the Executive Vice President at the Greater Irvine Chamber. And I want to thank you for attending today. Although our Orange County World Trade Week event was certainly intended to be a great coming together and focus point for everyone in trade and export and international activities, we hope that this solution made available by our very resourceful Jessica Yip, a business and international manager, proves to be as informative and as helpful as we look to chart a course through these really tough times ahead of us. Before we introduce our amazing talent that will be joining us today to share their insights and perspectives, I want to thank very much our sponsors for this. Again, this was supposed to be the large in-person event, but we had some people that really stuck by us, starting with, of course, presented by District Export Council of Southern California. And we want to thank all of the wonderful people with DEC for helping make this possible. The champion sponsors, Concordia University with Irvine, the Device Alliance, and our corporate sponsors, Edwards Life Sciences and Parker Aerospace. Thank you, everyone, for your cooperation and sponsorship. And then the Orange County World Trade Week began as a collaborative event. We worked with our trade agencies throughout Orange County and, quite frankly, Southern California, as well as our international American chambers. And we want to thank and recognize them for their continuing support. The Women in Trade, Orange County, the World Affairs Council, Orange County, SCORE, the U.S. Commercial Service, and our international American chambers, the British American Business Council, the Hong Kong Association of Southern California, the Iranian American Chamber of Commerce, the MAPLE, which is Canada, and the Vietnamese American Chamber of Commerce. Thank you again all to our great partners for helping us make this possible. As you can see, the program agenda for today is the final installment in a 3-day digitized Orange County World Trade Week Forum. Tuesday featured our U.S. commercial service partners in a trade overview. Yesterday's session welcomed keynote Mark O'Connell. I hope you both heard and experienced those two. Mark walked us through the current state of globalization and international affairs and essentially introduced us to our new world, if you will. Today, we welcome our panel of experts. We are going to remind you at the end of this program that all of these sessions are being recorded and they will be posted on our website. So those of you who could not join us today or who might have to leave early will still have access to it. So we also want to call your attention to the fact that in addition to our panel, we're going to honor the Exporter of the Year, Partner of the Year, and our Global Leadership Award. These are 3 of the awards that we obviously enjoy presenting in person to thunderous applause. And we will not be able to do that. So I'm asking all of you to send good energy when we make these announcements later in the program. Thank you. Now, let's get into the heart of this navigating the new trade landscape. When you see the quality of the panel that we have assembled, these amazing experts who have agreed to contribute their time. I mean, we have somebody who's calling in from London, and we have someone who's calling in from Asia, and apparently it's 1 a.m. in the morning there. So let's just understand how amazing this is for us. I'm going to introduce each of our panelists first, so you can understand their amazing credentials. And then we're going to kick off with a question allowing each of the panelists to talk about their area of expertise uninterrupted essentially for up to 10 minutes. And then we can get into an exchange and then have some important Q&A at the completion of it. So let me begin with Barry Cosgrave. Barry is a partner in the Banking and Asset Finance Practice Group at K&L Gates. Now, the reason K&L Gates holds a special place in my heart is because the London office of K&L Gates has been a great partner of ours in our foreign direct investment work in London and the UK. We're always very grateful for their generosity and support, so this is a special treat for me to welcome Barry. He divides his time between the firm's London and Dubai offices. He concentrates his practice on distressed debt and restructuring, debt capital markets, structured finance, and Islamic finance. Mr. Cosgrave advises on Middle East regulatory matters and is advisor to leading international banks, hedge funds, investment asset managers, and insurance companies on a full range of banking services. Mr. Cosgrave has worked on a number of first-of-a-kind Islamic finance structures that allow compliant investors to invest in conventional funds and asset classes in Europe and the United States. He's also an expert on BREXIT and what it means to the US and the world. So thank you, Barry. Glad you're here. Our next panelist is John Evans with Tractus Asia. And Tractus is a member of our chamber. And we're delighted to have John with us. And thank you very much for being up at this very early hour. But John is a founding partner and a managing director of Tractus Asia Limited. Tractus is an American-managed, Asian-based FDI consulting, providing both public and private sector trade and investment assistance. Over the years, Mr. Evans and the firm have advised more than $5 billion in trade and investment transactions across a wide variety of sectors. He has been a leader, instrumental in the development of the firm's 4 primary practice areas: economic development, strategy and implementation, corporate finance, and the Tractus Business Incubator. So imagine a 1 a.m. bright-eyed and bushy-tailed John, and we thank you for joining us, John. And last but absolutely not least is my good friend, Ken Wengrod. Ken is, Ken is one of the country's leading financial advisors. He is the co-founder of FTC Commercial Corporation 18 years ago, a global commercial finance corporation with domestic and international clienteles, primarily serving the apparel industry and consumer products, including William Rast, Justin Timberlake, Tom's Shoes, Sally Hershberger, Joe Jean's Kids, Maui and Sons, and many others. In 2019, Ken was appointed by Wilbur Ross, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and Robert E. Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, to serve on the Industry Trade Advisory Committee on small and minority businesses, and appointed member to the Trade Finance Advisory Council and the vice chair of the subcommittee Private-Public Partnerships. In 2018, he was awarded the President's E Award for Export Service. He also is chairman of the Regulatory and Legislation Committee and was appointed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce to the District Export Council of Southern California. So we welcome you as well, Ken, and we thank you for being with us. So here's where we start to have some fun, gentlemen. All right, what I'm going to do is kick us off with just a good general question. All right, and that is, the world is a different place now than it was just 6 months ago. 6 months ago, we had some issues that we were dealing with China and with Mexico and Canada and with BREXIT. But now we have the pandemic that's having an impact and footprint. So our global opportunity and all its opportunities are now in question on so many levels and for many reasons. So within the context of your experience and asking you to focus on the area of expertise while you're here today, how do you see the U.S. and quite frankly, specifically California, emerging and benefiting in some way from this situation? So we'll start with Barry.
Thank you, Linda, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It seems strange now to even think of Brexit. Nothing dominated our TV screens and news services quite like it until COVID came along, and suddenly sort of Brexit's taken a back seat. I think for the UK, Brexit was a huge shock. It was a very unexpected election result, and I know the US had a similarly unexpected election result around about the same time. It divides the country in two. It has nothing to do with how intelligent people are, how wealthy people are, even whatever business people work in international businesses, and it's completely 50-50 as to people who voted in favour of Brexit and who voted against it. I think that the recent election of the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson was an election that was run squarely on the Brexit issue. There had been talks of a second referendum, there was a groundswell of support for it, and I think the most recent election gave a resounding result in favour of Brexit. And I, as someone who voted against it, have now sort of reluctantly accepted that it's going to happen one way or the other. The COVID has clearly had a huge impact on the ability of Britain to do the thing that it wanted most, which was to enter into a trade deal with the United States. That was the stated aim, and there was a huge amount of emphasis placed on what we call the special relationship from this side of the pond, which really began with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and has kind of continued ever since. Tony Blair certainly nurtured it with two successive US presidents. Boris Johnson himself, I believe, was born in New York, so I think he recently relinquished his US passport, but he has a natural affinity with the US. I think Brexit, as a result, we have to now look at it as an opportunity, not as a disaster. The EU is the single biggest trading bloc in the world, but we can't ignore the fact that the United States is the biggest single economy, that China is the second biggest economy, and actually, if you took California out of the United States, I believe it has the world's fifth biggest economy. And there's a lot of affinities between Britain and California, particularly in the areas of bio and medicine, biotech and medicine. I think you have a huge amount of industry in the UK, but it tends to be small and medium-sized. It's very specialist, and it deals with things like components for engines manufactured by Rolls-Royce, and deals with some very specialist medical inventions and developments. Oxford and Cambridge University are two of the leading universities, and Cambridge University certainly piled a huge amount of money into developing its medical research facilities. And I think there's a huge affinity as a result with Orange County in particular, given the amount of biotech that springs up in that particular area as a particular hub for it. One of the issues that people have talked about in the UK is, well, stepping out of the EU, you lose a lot of the collaboration in terms of biotech, in terms of technology, in terms of all sorts of developments that were shared amongst European institutions. But I think the reality is, for British people, they're pretty resourceful. It's an island nation. They've always sort of stood alone, and there's a mentality of standing alone and facing up to bigger counterparties. The question that I have is, when striking a bargain, as Britain seeks to do, with a country like the US, with a country like China, with a country like India, who holds the ace in the bargaining position? Clearly for the UK, it's always going to be tough for the US with the world's biggest economy. But I do think there is a huge affinity. Britain really, on the whole, imports goods and exports services. And any goods that they export tend to be specialist and tend to be quite niche. And I think that suits it quite well, being outside the European Union, mostly because the EU is founded really on an agricultural union. British agriculture has been in decline for decades, if not centuries, whereas it's the central pillar of the French economy. Similarly with Germany, Germany is very much a manufacturing-based economy, really around the automotive sector. That is clearly changing and actually has taken a huge hit as a result of COVID. People are simply not buying cars anymore. So Britain now becomes a sort of a lone wolf, an outward-looking country that's looking to market itself as a place where You can find specialist engineering equipment, development of specialist technology, specialist areas within medicine, and specialist components for manufacturing, which I think if you look at California, innovation is in California's DNA. It's the hotbed of technology. They've invented every aspect of social media. And it's something that I think for British people outward looking now, the US is going to be one of the key markets, and California itself is going to be a hugely important market for the type of work that British people do. Facebook inherited our former Deputy Prime Minister, who used to be an old neighbour of mine, Nick Clegg, as their international relations manager. And you can see there's that sort of natural crossover between the two. That's not to say that Britain isn't going to look elsewhere. Clearly, in terms of imports, China is going to become ever more important, and striking a good trade deal with China will be extremely valuable. But one of the issues that has been raised in the UK repeatedly is around our health service. I'm sure everyone knows this, but our health service is a publicly funded health service, so funded by the taxpayer. So it's free at the point of service, and it's clearly been under enormous stress recently for obvious reasons with the crisis. But there has been an enormous groundswell of support for an already extremely popular national service. One of the issues that has always been highlighted is whether the fact that there's private healthcare in the US, is any trade deal with the US would lead to some sort of privatization of the NHS. And there's all sorts of slogans thrown around by protesting politicians that Donald Trump wants to buy our NHS. I think that is at best far-fetched. I don't think there's any intention to do that. But I think what we do need to do, and there's a very difficult conversation to be had in the UK around how we improve the NHS, because it's become a political hot potato. If you're on the left, it's completely untouchable and has to be just given more money. If you're on the right and you say anything needs to be reformed, you're accused of trying to privatize and destroy the institution. But the reality is it's incredibly inefficient. What the NHS really needs is innovation, and it needs to borrow best practice. And I think the ability now to have a closer relationship with the US and to see how things might be done is an opportunity to pick the best bits and leave aside the bits that aren't so good and aren't working so well. I also think it creates a great opportunity for British entrepreneurs to market their services into the US. I have a client who they are an incubator, and they had a wonderful invention, which was a sort of a casing for an iPad that would allow a surgeon to take an iPad into the operating theatre and in real time, either show what they were doing, but also update their notes and record what they were doing in terms of the procedures and keeping records. It took them 9 months to get a meeting with someone in the NHS. So my client flew them to the US, and within a day, they'd shifted 75,000 units to various healthcare operators in the US. And just goes to show that I think the US has a much more entrepreneurial spirit that sort of marries well with the British spirit of being slightly more reserved, but nevertheless developing strong products. So I think, we now have to, there's been a shift, and COVID has surprisingly not slowed down the timetable for Brexit. It's still happening on the 31st of December of this year. I find that impossible to believe. I think both administrations in the US and the UK are far too busy dealing with this crisis and the health crisis and the tragic events that have surrounded it to be spending time talking about a trade deal. I know that discussions have begun, but I suspect, and I think anyone sensible, even the most ardent Brexit supporter would agree, an extension of at least 6 months, if not 12 months, to that deadline is necessary. What frustrates people is that technically Britain is restricted from how much it can negotiate in terms of trade deals until such time as it has formally left the EU. And there's consequently this a difficult time lag between leaving and then actually having a deal with or doing the deals that they wanted to do with, for instance, the US, with China, and with many other countries. But one of the other benefits that Britain has is the slightly outdated but nevertheless very real concept of the Commonwealth, which includes a number of former imperial colonies, Australia, New Zealand and others, and India, which gives them sort of a natural trade association, which combined with its ongoing special relationship with the US actually is a very strong foundation to allow them to quite quickly reach the sorts of trade deals that they need to reach in order to keep flourishing as an economy, because the economy in the in the UK, and I know it's the same in the US, but there is an enormous decline. We had a 5% contraction in the economy in Q1 of this year, and that only involved 2 weeks of COVID. Q2, they're looking at anywhere between 5 and 30% contraction in the economy, which is pretty catastrophic for a relatively small nation of 60 million people. But that being said, I think that the nature of this crisis is there is an end to it. I think the previous financial crisis, when Lehman Brothers went down, was had a contagion effect. This crisis is so all-encompassing that I think we're almost going to hit a reset button when everybody starts to go to work. And I know certain cities and certain counties in the US have already implementing return to work protocols. It's slowly happening in the UK as of Wednesday, in fact. So I think that will lead to something of a shot in the arm for the economy, and I think you'll see a more of a V-shaped recovery this time around, as opposed to some of the flat recovery we had over a decade ago. But I think key to all of that is going to be the ability of Britain to be outward-looking, the ability to trade with nations such as the US, especially parts of the US that have a natural affinity with the UK, and I think California probably is top of that list, alongside New York City. And I think, as a result, there are a huge number of opportunities for everybody to engage in trade together, and Britain can export its services and import goods as it kind of has always done.
Well, we have that's one of those situations where it's good news, bad news, but it sounds like there's a little bit of a opportunity there for California based on your read. And yeah, we experienced that with our foreign direct investment work over there, a really good synergy between the life science and technology sectors in and around Orange County in Southern California and the UK. So terrific. That's a good place to start. Now we're going to turn, John, to you. And same question, which is, the world is a different place now. And we're looking at how to manage our way out of this and come out emerging perhaps stronger or more successful than before. So tell us from your Asian perspective what you think this looks like for us.
Thank you, Linda. First, I'm going to start from an Asia perspective. I'm going to start from a China perspective. And I think to talk about COVID-19, you need to look at it as just the most recent of either a black swan or a gray swan event that is occurring. And COVID-19 has just so closely followed up on the US-China trade tensions that were ongoing. And when that came to that phase 1 agreement in November of last year, there was a lot of optimism. And it seemed as if the two nations were trying to at least align in resolving some of the trade dispute issues. China made, of course, pledges to purchase U.S. goods at a very large dollar amount. And the U.S. also got some concessions on China looking at structural issues that it had never really addressed or abided by under the terms of its WTO ascension. And so there was optimism. And I think that if you look at the US-China trade war, you look at the impact on the economies and in particular companies directly, where they, and it didn't matter which side of the Pacific you were on, but if you were importing into China or you were exporting out of China and into the US, you were being hit with tariff impacts. And those were to some extent being passed on to the consumer, but also in some extent not in being absorbed by those companies. So margins got thinner. And this, China was still forecasting at the end of this last year and beginning of this year, this robust sort of 6% economic growth. Well, in comes the COVID-19. It originates in China. And I think anyone that was based here in Asia, we saw it, we felt it, it impacted us first. And while the rest of the world, whether it was North America or the EU, was going about its business, the companies that we were working with in China were being impacted, and they were in crisis management in early January. And the the situation rapidly deteriorated. And so I feel like for those of us working in that environment here, we're a little bit ahead. And then you look at what are some of the major issues that were going on as this hit. And so you had this increased cost structure in China. You had this trade tensions that were ongoing. And all of a sudden, China experiences its first recession. So the first 3 quarters is the first recession in more than 2 decades. That is completely an unknown event for 2 generations of Chinese. They don't understand it. It hasn't happened, right? And so all of a sudden, what you believed couldn't happen in having a significant slowdown in your economy was happening. Even though all the signs were there that it was already slowing down, it was being managed, and quite successfully being managed, as it slowed down. And so you introduce COVID-19. And so if you think about the Chinese economy is slowing, what does that mean? Well, first of all, having never experienced this, the Chinese consumer, who is much better still at saving money than others, stopped spending and got more conservative in their approach. So as China was trying to go away from this export-driven model to the US and the rest of the world and focus on a domestic consumption has slowed. That's further compounding the economic slowdown that's in China. Now, there have been a lot of government-initiated stimulus and support for the employees. The other thing that China has done is China, like many of its Asian neighbors, has managed the viral curve much better. And from a political standpoint, you could point your finger at China and say they did this, they didn't do this, they didn't disclose this. Let's get rid of all that noise. The reality is China did, from a public health standpoint, what needed to be done: stopped all transportation, put in place technologies and apps to track people's movements, which of course in the US you can't do that because it's violating our rights. But at the same time, they developed, and I'll give you an example. If my employees were leaving to go to the office, they on their phone, they scanned in with a health security officer when they left their apartment. When they got to the subway, they scanned again. When they got to the office, they scanned again. If during that day you had come in the proximity of somebody who was suspected of being infected, you would get a message and your phone would turn from green to yellow and say, you need to report in to be checked for COVID. If it was if you were in the proximity of somebody that had definitely had COVID, it would turn to red and it would give you a specific number of hours to come in. And so what they did is they flattened that viral curve, that overused statement that everybody's debating in the US of whether it's necessary or not. And they've put themselves in this position where they're one of the first economies to come back. Up until last week, we have 9 offices in Asia. The only one that wasn't working from home was our China office, and that office has been working for 5 weeks already, back to normal. Our Vietnamese office came back to normal this past week. Our Thailand office, where I'm based here in Bangkok now, after 12 years in Shanghai, will be back in our office next week. And so when you're thinking about opportunities for California, and particularly for Orange County and Irvine, if I'm thinking about where I'm going to export goods and where I'm going to create business, I'm going to be thinking about Asia. And the reason why is China is, while slowed as an economy, is the world's 2nd largest economy. The other big economies in the region, Japan and Korea, also have effectively managed the viral impact, and economies are getting back to normal. Some of the Southeast Asian nations, as I just mentioned, are starting to get back to normal. And these are areas that had anywhere between, at the low end, 2%, at the high end, 6% economic growth. That, of course, will all be tempered and less than it was before. But if you compare that where the US is in terms of its viral curve management, as well as the economic impacts. From my perspective, the economic impacts are just starting, and the U.S. is not gonna recover, like Barry just said. He thinks the UK will in a V. I think at best we're going to be wheelbarrow shaped in the U.S. and it's going to be this is going to be a struggle. I think today's data on the unemployment filings was again 3 million persons were applying, and so if we're looking at 25% unemployment across the United States, that won't be something that gets solved easily. And so if I'm sitting and I'm thinking, in California, where am I going to see business growth? I'm going to look to Asia, as Barry mentioned earlier, basis. But China yourself is the third largest trading partner with California. If you add in the rest of Asia, it quickly goes past Canada, number 2, and is on par with Mexico as number 1, depending on how you add those numbers up. And those are the economies I was talking about that are recovering. So if I'm sitting in Irvine in Orange County and I'm thinking about what is my business? Well, if I'm in the medical device space or biotech, I think Barry also mentioned that, there are clear opportunities in healthcare to be exporting. So from a trade perspective, there's also clear opportunities from a foreign direct investment standpoint to bring businesses back that have located overseas that could be setting up in California. So medtech is needed both from an export basis into most of the Asian economies, and manufacturing that had moved is now going to come back, not just because the US government feels that they want to de-risk and make sure that pharmaceuticals and personal protection equipment and medical equipment are manufactured in the US. That trend was already happening. China was no longer that low-cost manufacturing base that you could supply the world. So nearshoring and reshoring was already occurring before COVID. And when you put in the US-China trade war and COVID back to back, risk mitigation from a business strategy becomes much, much more important in how you're looking at things. So back to the export potential, if I'm sitting in California, I'm thinking about how do I quickly get in front of buyers in Asia? And how can I leverage the fact that their economies are becoming healthier faster than we are in the US and bring some revenue back to the US from that standpoint? And maybe I'll wrap up there and we can go on to Ken.
Thank you, John. Again, a lot to think about for us particularly. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to turn to Ken, and I'm going to ask Ken, put your expertise to work here with this, the new USMCA. What differences did it bring to us from the original NAFTA? But also, what's the COVID-19 over implications? How can we emerge from all of this and better leverage the relationships with Mexico and California?
Thank you, Linda. I think I'd like to start. COVID created a major change in a mentality. Before COVID, I'm going to be addressing it from consumerism. The consumer said, because I can, they would spend. During COVID, their mentality changed because I have to. And post-COVID, they're going to have an attitude because I want to. I don't see this pent-up demand and consumerism. People are getting used to living with less. They're looking at things differently. We saw the same phenomena after the Depression, after when our troops came back from World War II. There's going to be new markets, but people are going to be watching where they spend, and they're going to be much more practical. And to me, it's very important. The other aspect is, before I get into the USMCA, people are going to be addressing, what do we really need? And why do we need to waste money? I'm looking at this from a very practical point of view, in as much as what people have really never addressed is something I call queue time and idle time in production. How long does it take to go from here to China and back and forth? That's a function of time and money. So if we can produce locally, we can do it much more efficiently. And with today, with automation, productivity has greatly improved. We're producing more cars in the States prior to COVID than ever before. And to me, we have to look at what the real costs are. And this is where the USMCA plays in such an important role, because between Canada and Mexico, they're right here. What the new regulations that were put in, and John was mentioning about doing more exports to China. But the thing that's concerning is the IP protection. With the USMCA, they put in, I think it goes up to 75 years for copyright, and they increase it to 15 years for industrial design. People are always concerned what's going on in certain parts of Asia, primarily China, about protecting their rights. The USMCA put special chapters dealing with the SOEs, state-owned enterprises. That's a major issue for companies doing business in China. They had to give up their intellectual proprietary information to do business in China. With the USMCA, that is all protected. There's also specific clauses for SMEs, because the growth of this economy in the world is with SMEs, and to me, with consumerisms. So what we're going to see is more and more people coming back. Prior to this discussion, John and I had a discussion on the pharma. 95% of the production was coming out of China. Well, we should be able to produce that efficiently right here, under this control, with the USMCA and in the United States as well. So those are very important ideas that people are going to be looking at to reduce costs. We know that labor costs have been on par with Mexico for years, but China always controls, especially in the apparel industry. Yes, you can cut and sew in Vietnam or Bangladesh, but China represented the cluster manufacturing concept, so they had the textile mills. So it was very difficult for people just to pick up and leave and move their supply chains. So all this is going to take time and readdress. Mexico has a lot of those supply chains in terms of textiles and mills and production. So I see a lot of it coming back to the three countries. And I think this is going to be very important, not only for labor, because labor is not as important as it was years ago because of productivity and automation. So people could produce here very efficiently. For instance, in textiles, we take our US cotton and export it to China. So many days on the water in China. Then they basically spin the cotton. Well, and then send it back as gray goods, or make the textiles in China, and then distribute it around Asia to do the laborious tasks of cut and sew. But you know what? With today's technology, you could build a spinning plant in California for $30 or $40 million, and probably employ it with 3 people, and 2 of those people are keeping the other person awake to run the equipment. And this would reduce costs by 20 to 30% on textiles, because you don't have to go back and forth in the water. So that's why nearshoring and inshoring is going to be so important on supply chains. And the other aspect, especially with the USMCA, I don't want to get into from a political perspective, but none of the free trade agreements previously ever addressed currency manipulation. In the USMCA, there's a section on currency manipulation to protect. There is also a section that if any of the parties between Canada, the US, or Mexico or enter into another free trade agreement, they have to advise the other 2 parties. So there's a lot of coordination. This is very important to make this agreement a lot stronger. And the other aspect is in digital trade. There's more and more, and we're seeing this with COVID, there's more and more business doing online. And that comes in to some of the benefits of the USMCA because they protect the source code, that is domiciled with the country that has it. In addition, the de minimis has been increased so you can make small shipments to the countries. And that's very important because it's very expensive to ship from the US online to somebody in China. You don't have $10 and $15 FedEx charges. It's a lot more to make those movements. So what I see today is, especially for California, there's going to be tremendous opportunity because California not only represents, as Barry pointed out, the innovation and creativity between the movie industry, the entertainment industry, the medical, and also consumer-related products in supplements. When the Department of Commerce brought in people under Discover Global Markets, one of the things we learned when the Consul Generals and the embassies came here in Orange County, we learned that a lot of Southern California products are much in demand in Europe and Asia. So US manufacturers, especially in California, should be looking to move their products to foreign markets and not take an insular view, because 95% of their business is outside the US. And I think now they realized that why compete with just the US merchants here or vendors and suppliers and buyers? They should be looking around the world where they can sell their products very efficiently. But then it all comes into credit worthiness. Those customers, when a US entrepreneur sells their products, they must have sources to be able to know that there's credit approval, either through the EXIM or credit insurance or factoring. And a lot of these customers are credit approval, as John and Barry and I are aware. And so those markets are open. We just have to open up our eyes and realize how we could get these products to the foreign markets and expand their business in a different manner. And I hope that gives you a little backup for what I was saying.
Thank you, Ken. It does. So, gentlemen, yeah, just amazing insight and perspective. We thank you so very much. We do have one question, and then I've got a few here that I think will keep us going for a few minutes. Question, as someone based in Thailand, John, and doing business there, which Asian countries do you think will emerge fastest and in best shape?
Okay, good question. China is already doing that. Korea is the next one. Taiwan, depending whether you lump it in with China or not, is already recovering. Japan had a little bit of a setback with COVID, but is on its way to recovery. And then in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore I think will be the first one. Singapore had a bit of a COVID setback recently, but that was a very specific population. And so being a small nation, the numbers look a little skewed. But those would be the countries that I would focus on in Asia.
Terrific, thank you. Okay, I've got a quick question here on the, when we're looking at Brexit, Barry, I'm curious to know from your perspective, it looks like there's not, there's hard feelings, if you will, that there's not between the EU and, you know, and the UK, that they're not the best of friends right now for obvious reasons. Will that take a toll in any way? Will that make it more difficult for US to do business in the UK and or Europe as well?
I think the short answer to that is no. The more nuanced answer is you're right, there is ill feeling. I think a lot of that though is based, is a personality issue. I think if you're running a business in the UK and you're trading, you have a trading partner in France or Germany, both people are business people, and will react to this as being unfortunate, disappointing, something no one wanted, and certainly those trading partners necessarily didn't want, but they want to keep doing business. And politicians can fall out with each other as much as they like, and we have a bit of a character over here called Nigel Farage, who likes to sort of wave a Union Jack and sort of thumb his nose at EU politicians, and he actually sat in the EU Parliament for a number of years. But I think that bad blood is perhaps it's as between politicians, and I think everyday people understand the importance of trade and sort of getting on with things. And I think to your question, I mean, I don't think, you know, the economic power that the US holds is such that people are very pragmatic, and I don't think the EU or the UK will do themselves any favors by trying to sort of give the US the cold shoulder. So I don't see that as causing any specific issues. I think, as usual, it's the sort of the playground politics that we're all witness to in every jurisdiction in the world that makes this seem as though it's a big issue. But I think really everyday people will get over it and get on with life as it should be.
All right, I actually suspect that Linda has disconnected from our chat, but I do have the next question that she had left with me before she had DC'd. So what would you recommend our exporters do in the coming months to stabilize or grow their market shares through global trade? I think this question is probably appropriate for all three of you. Barry, did you want to start? And then we'll go to John and then Kenneth after.
Yeah, sure. Happy to lead off. It's an interesting question. I mean, what should any of us do in the coming weeks and months? We're all in a very peculiar situation, and some are coming out of it, but everyone's working from home. It's very hard to do the things you want to do. I mean, I don't know how long it's going to be before someone can jump on a plane from California to London or vice versa to go and meet people. You know, when will we shake hands again? As it's most basic. You know, even if I were to fly to California tomorrow, would clients want to meet me face to face? So I think what we have to do is look at the technology that's available to us, the platform we're on today. You know, I'm sitting here in southwest London, and there's people in Asia, people in California, we're able to communicate very well. And I think it's being proactive is probably the most important thing, and really zeroing in on the things that are important to your business and important to what you do, and identifying the counterparties that you think you're going to be trading with, and really zeroing in on them and trying to build those relationships, albeit in slightly peculiar circumstances, you know, online and across time zones. But I think that's all any of us really can do, and also be ready for an adjusted world that we come back into, a very different competitive landscape for many businesses, a very different day-to-day landscape in terms of the office and interacting with people. But that's really all I'm doing at the moment is trying to keep in touch with people and make sure we're looking out for each other and hoping that when things do restart again, that we can really push things forward, because, you know, no matter how small a part it might be, we all have our part to play in the recovery.
I'll add on to that, Barry. I think you used a word that I want to stress. You said proactive. And I think that it's really important for exporters looking at markets in Asia to be proactive. And while you're no longer getting on planes, running around, doing those things, it's actually a good time to target markets and do a little bit of research into those markets. And if you think about Asia as a whole, you have a very diverse group of countries, a very diverse group of product and service needs. And so doing a little research right now and targeting which markets have the highest potential for you is something that can be done while you're sitting from home. And whether you're doing that using technology and, you know, searches and Google functions and doing it yourself, or you're hiring firms to help you, both of those options are there. And then you commented on, you know, how business has changed a little bit. And I think one of the areas of focus that I would recommend is looking at e-commerce platforms. So e-commerce platforms and e-commerce sales in Asia are the fastest growing channel to the consumer in almost all of the countries. And it's a much easier one once you understand it to get set up. much less costly, and can be done remotely. And then finally, just to add on your comment about getting on planes, I'm someone who flew 300,000 miles last year. I've flown once to the US before the crisis started. I'm in a whole different world. And one of the things that I have learned in the past few months was that I used to get on a plane to go meet somebody and start a relationship with them. Now, using technologies like we're using today with Zoom, by the time I've had 2, 3, 4 Zoom calls with somebody, my next trip is going to be to conclude a deal. And so I'm actually, from a cost perspective, decreasing the cost of developing my market and customer. And that's become very apparent to us as a firm and to a lot of our clients. So those are some things I think that people can do.
And I'll add to that, John. I think that the world is coming and have come to become a world of virtuality, as we're seeing today. And I see that travel and shipping is going to change dramatically. The cost of travel isn't going to be like it was before. It's going to get extremely expensive for each flight, almost what we saw in the 50s and 60s. You're going to see different people flying. We're not going to see the low budget, for a long time, low budget flights. And you're going to see the same thing with shipping. The cost of shipping between continents are going to go up dramatically. There's going to be a lot of potential shipping lines having their own issues and having financial problems. And with all that I said, this turmoil gives great opportunity to exporters, because those that can watch every penny and conserve and find their markets, the very first place I would start is with cultures. We can't just talk about Asia or Europe, because even within Europe, each country, each subsection, especially in consumerism, they like different colors. They like different aspects. So as Americans, we have to truly understand the subcultures when we're exporting, and especially in Asia. Even within China, there's so many subcultures. From Beijing to Shanghai, Hong Kong looks at themselves as Hong Kongese, and Taiwanese, etc. So each of those subcultures have their own ways of doing business and buying and purchasing. And I think we need to take a lot of time to truly understand the cultures, and the Department of Commerce can help greatly in this area. So before you start entering a new market, you really have to understand who you're dealing with, understand who they really are and what they need, and then figure out how to sell that market and how do you protect your product in terms of IP, in terms of control, in terms of also getting paid. Because the most important thing is you can ship, but you want to make sure you get paid that and have that money flow back. So that you have to look at every way to mitigate your downside. And to me, this is important. This is a tremendous opportunity with COVID, that people are going to be looking at things differently. And how do people exploit those changes from a positive way, I think is going to be very important. And I think the US merchandise and products, from high tech to consumer, are in much need in the rest of the world.
Gentlemen, at this point, I want to thank you again for your generosity of time and expertise, for helping everyone in Irvine, Orange County, Southern California, everyone around the globe that's tuned into this, perhaps make better decisions moving forward through some really murky waters. But I will tell you, if you were here live, you would be getting thunderous and rapturous applause. So let's just pretend that that's happening, all right? And again, we thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, now I am going to turn this program over to my wonderful colleague, Jessica Yip, who's going to take us into the Exporter of the Year nominees. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you for the introduction, Linda. I'm very excited to introduce our Exporter of the Year nominees this year. Each year, we recognize an Exporter of the Year, which is an Orange County company that has demonstrated growth, resilience, and leadership in exports. We're proud to introduce the 4 companies that were nominated this year, each one an example of successful market expansion through export strategies, representing their community or their sphere of influence. So this year's Export of the Year winner started with humble origins in Santa Ana 10 years ago by 3 best friends who saw a need in their community and sought to fulfill a niche, developing a high-quality hair pomade to provide to friends. They took their branding a step further and dove into the custom car, motorcycle, tattoo, and barber culture to reinvent the grooming product industry that had become stagnant in the previous decades around the globe. This company surmounted immense challenges as they entered the international markets, facing foreign cosmetic registrations and regulations, formulation changes, cultural differences in foreign markets, international trademarking, language barriers, and more, but overcame each obstacle with commitment, ingenuity, and elbow grease. They now export to over 55 countries and manufacture over 100 different men and women's hair products, grooming products, and cosmetics in Orange County alone. Their exports accounting for 25% of their current revenue and growing. We're so pleased to announce the 2020 Exporter of the Year. Drum roll, please. Suavecito, congratulations. Your recognition is well-deserved for your dedication, your willingness to take risks, and observable success in strategy and growth in markets, in global markets. So well done, congratulations. We'll be in communication after this event and work with you to highlight your company and showcase it to the rest of Orange County and our viewers.
Again,
So,
thunderous applause, right? Woo!
Exactly. So without further ado, Linda, I want to turn the program back over to you. I know we have a few other announcements we want to make before the program is over. So take it away.
We do. And thank you for your patience, everyone, but this is important. These next 2 awards, in addition to our Exporter of the Year, are always so important part of our Orange County World Trade Week event. They're the one opportunity where we can say a special thank you to people who have just been shoulder to shoulder with us, moving our initiatives and international and trade and exporting agendas forward. So with that, I want to introduce our 2020 Partner of the Year. And again, they certainly deserve more than an online recognition, but this is what we have. So we're going to introduce our Partner of the Year. I call him a man of the world, or at least of North American continent, having lived and worked in all 3 countries. He began his career in Canada with Loblaw Food Products, moved into Pillsbury as Director of Marketing for Prepared Foods, and then joined Pizza Hut as Director of Marketing. Having conquered and succeeded at food products, he then set out to master healthcare technologies, logging over 10 years with Hello Health, Clinicomp, and Patient Care Technology Systems. And now he is principal at his own marketing and consulting firm, helping businesses and this chamber move their missions and objectives forward. So while this was an impressive career to date, it's also interesting that his commitment to Irvine and Orange County in California led him to co-found the Maple Business Council with his partner, determined to forge a solid bridge between Canada and California. And with this commitment, he's demonstrated more than his ability to be a champion of trade and investment from Canada into California and vice versa. Having executed several very successful missions to Vancouver and Toronto, which we participated with, in which Irvine and Orange County were featured, developing newsletters that built networks and collaborating with partners to deliver blogs, webinars, and volunteer leadership, the Chamber's international development initiatives, his generosity brings to the forefront of trade and international business. And as a result, we are so proud. Please help me congratulate, you can use Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, Stephen Armstrong, Orange County World Trade Week 2020 Partner of the Year. Woohoo! Thank you, Stephen, for all your support and wonderful. All right, and now last but absolutely not least, the 2020 Global Leadership Award, as you know, which was launched just a couple of years ago. by my wonderful boss, Brian Starr. And the Global Leadership Award recognizes a leadership of perhaps a level that includes both career, but also commitment to chamber initiatives and the growth of the profile of Irvine and Orange County and California throughout the world. This year's Global Leadership Award is being presented to a longtime chamber board member, global representative of one of Irvine's oldest and most innovative life science companies, chair of our International Development Committee for 2 years, and almost literally the birth mother of the Chamber's ambitious and very successful Foreign Direct Investment Initiative, our missions to the UK, and our Life Science Showcase. As Senior Director, Government Affairs for Edwards Life Sciences, she directs the company's legislative issues in the 50 US states and now global government affairs since 2015. Her government affairs experience includes Director of Public Affairs for Pacific Care, a principal in Booston and Company, a Dallas-based consulting firm, and Vice President for a Public Affairs Coalition for the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers. And she began her career working on political campaigns. In addition to serving on the Chamber Board, she also serves on the California Life Sciences Association Political Action Committee and the AdvaMed PAC Board, advocating for medical device industry. This year's recipient is a champion for her company and Irvine and all around the world, and a tireless advocate and supporter of the Chamber, contributing greatly to the value of our work. We are so proud to award this year's Global Leadership Award to Lee Vokeland. Congratulations, Lee, and thank you so much for all of your support and help over the years. All right, and with that, ladies and gentlemen and friends, this concludes our program. The Greater Irvine Chamber, District Export Council, and all our sponsors and international partners, thank you for your time and support of this year's digital Orange County World Trade Week. We hope you found this year's program informative and helpful. Recordings of all the 3 days events will be provided on our website landing page at bit.ly/OCWTW 2020, and you'll have access to all the content at your convenience. We'll also follow up this session with an email including any contact information for our panelists in case you have subsequent questions. Please remember the Greater Irvine Chamber and our partners are here for you as a resource. Don't hesitate to reach out. Don't hesitate to go to our Chamber website to check out our emergency resources and our re-entry resources to help you build back your company and recover and thrive. Take care, everyone. Be safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we will all see each other in person next year.